Hello there and welcome to the only Orianna guide you'll ever need. Let me start off by saying that I think Orianna is a great champion to pick up because she requires a lot of skills that also translates to other champions. So if you're not interested in maining Orianna but just including her in your champion pool, that's also not a problem because many of the skills required to play Orianna will translate to other champions. Now the goal of this video is to serve as an in-depth Orianna guide that you can always come back to. So if you don't feel like watching the entire guide right now, that's no problem, you can just take it step by step and always come back later. This guide is basically a framework that you always have access to when wanting to learn or review something no matter what point of your climb you're currently at. Now if you want me to help you out even further through personal coaching, feel free to check out the link in the description down below. Now with that being said, let's get started. When it comes to maining a new champion, understanding the champion's identity is by far the most important thing to know. Orianna is a control mage, and if there's one thing you need to understand about control mages, it's that they're extremely consistent. As a control mage, your job is to always be alive. You're always ready to wave clear, to teamfight, to control objectives, etc. Not dying is the most important part of playing a control mage. Now more specifically, Orianna's relatively short cooldowns, long range and ball mechanics makes her a great laner and even a lane bully in many matchups. On top of that, she has great wave clear that allows her to get lane prio quite easily, and it also allows her to protect objectives and stall out games. One of Orianna's biggest strengths is even though she's a great laner, she also scales extremely well, which makes her a very consistent pick for all stages of the game. Her team fighting is also outstanding, especially with her ultimate that allows her to change the outcome of an entire fight or even of the game. One of the main reasons why Orianna is great at team fighting is due to her objective control with her ball mechanic. As Orianna, you can easily zone an entire team from entering the river or catch a high value target off guard by hiding your ball in terrain. And last but not least, Orianna brings a good mix of damage and utility to the table. Now it's also important that we understand Orianna's key weaknesses, so that we can try to avoid playing around them and even try to fix them. The main weakness of Orianna is the fact that she's quite immobile. If you've ever played Orianna versus something like Sylas mid, Sejuani jungle, you probably noticed that the game feels quite unplayable the second you make a minor mistake. Due to her lack of mobility, Orianna is quite a mechanical champion and it's really difficult to master her. When playing Orianna, it's a lot less forgiving to overextend and have poor warding compared to a champion that has a lot of mobility, like LeBlanc for example. Now this means that spacing, always trying to bully your opponent at maximum range, and warding properly is very important and even necessary to play Orianna at her full potential. Now that also means that when picking up Orianna, you might have to improve your core fundamental gameplay like warding, positioning, etc. That is what makes Orianna quite a difficult champion to master, but it also means that you will learn and pick up a lot of skills that will help you out with playing other champions as well. So in general, playing Orianna will make you a hell of a better mid laner than you are right now, which is not the case for all champions out there. I'm gonna try my best to explain to you guys the abilities of Orianna. Now before we start with anything else, typically you would like to start off with your passive, but I'm gonna start off with our Q, because our Q is basically our bread and butter, and in order to understand our passive and everything else, we kind of need to know what Q does. Alright, so let's get started. So our Q says, Orianna commands her ball to move to an area, dealing magic damage to surrounding enemies and to enemies it passes through. It deals 30% less damage to all enemies it passes through after the first. Now what you need to understand about this is that whenever I press Q, I just move this ball. I can just move it in whatever direction I want. There's a slight delay. It looks a bit predictable, but I can move it in every single direction that I want to. Now, when I start coaching people on Orianna, like when they just main Orianna, like in the very beginning, like the first couple of games, they always think that their Q only does damage where it ends up being, right? So right now, they only think it would do damage here. That's not true at all. Your Q actually, if I put my Q all the way to here, my Q does damage to all of these enemies, right? So it doesn't only do damage where it ends up, it does damage from its starting point all the way to where it ends up and everything in between. So all the enemies in between it passes through. Right? Now, what's very important about this is that right now you can see, wait, it's a bit bugged, but let me do it again. Yeah, this dummy here took more damage than the second and the third one, right? And that is because, like it says here, your ball, your Q will deal 30% less damage to all enemies after the first. So yes, your ball does damage to everything it passes through, like all the enemies it passes through, like minions, jungle camps, champions. But only the first jungle monster or the first minion or the first champion that it hits will take the full damage. And everything beyond the first will take the same 70% damage. That's also a big misconception on Orianna. When people start maining her, they believe that her Q deals less damage to the second target. It deals even less damage to the third and even less to the fourth. But that would be a really weak ability. So instead, that would be really bad for wave clear and stuff. So instead, your Q does damage the same amount, like 129, you can see it here. It does the same damage to all the targets beyond the first. So it doesn't keep on diminishing. It does always 70% damage beyond the first target. Now, the reason why I talked about that Q is because I wanted to mention it during my explanation of the passive. So what is your passive? Orianna's abilities originate from her ball. Orianna's ball automatically returns to her if she is too far away from it. So that's the first part of your passive, but people kind of underestimate this, but it's actually quite important to know. It's very straightforward, but it's important to know. For example, if an enemy was here and I had to Q him, and now I'm walking away and I didn't really pay attention to my ball, you can see that the further I walk away from it, this color here, this indicator will change. If I'm close, it's blue. If I walk away, it's yellow. And if I'm very close to like breaking this barrier here, it's going to be red. And now what happens if I walk away here, the ball teleports to me. So if I get out of range, the ball will not stay in this position. It will just teleport onto me, which is an important mechanic. Now, why is this important? Well, let's say I want to hit an enemy that's here. Well, I can walk up all the way like this and then like try to Q them. But look how long it takes to travel. Look how predictable this is. Instead, what I would want to do, if my ball is here and I would want to hit an enemy, I could walk, like let's say I don't have, like we're going to talk about other abilities. There's also another way to do this. But if we just look at Q, the best way to do this, instead of like right now trying to Q, I can just walk out of range and right now Q. Right? Because if I walk out of range, the ball immediately teleports onto me. And then when the ball is onto me, like this distance is very short and it goes really quickly. So walking out of range, let the ball teleport onto you and then queuing is a lot faster than trying to drag the ball from here all the way to here. Now let's talk about the second part of our passive that doesn't really have anything to do with our ball. Orianna's attacks, so her auto attacks, deal an additional magic damage. Subsequent attacks against the same target within 4 seconds deal an additional damage with a certain maximum. Now, what is this all about? Well, this is all about if we do an auto attack here, look, I don't really gain a stack, but my second auto attack will gain a stack. My third auto attack will gain me a second stack, and all the other attacks beyond that one will just end up being on 2 stacks. So how does this work? Just like I said, your first auto attack that you do on a target is just normal damage. Your second auto attack is 1 stack and does more damage. I accidentally did 2. So I'm going to wait for it. So we do, I think my auto attack is on. I think that's why. Oh no, it's not. So we do 1 auto attack. We just do normal damage. We do a second auto attack. We do more damage. We do a third auto attack. Right now it's fully capped. This is our most damage. And if we do a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th auto attack, it will all do the same damage just as our 2 stacks. So just as our third auto attack. So the way it works is you do 1 auto attack on an enemy, right? Your second auto attack will do increased damage. Your third auto attack will do increased damage. But your 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th will just do the same damage just as your third. So your auto attack damage caps when you reach 3 auto attacks. Another thing that's important with this is that your stacks do not translate over to other people. So right now, let's stack it up. So right now we have 2 stacks. If I try to attack another champion, I need to stack it again. So my stacks, they don't translate over to other people, which is a bit unfortunate, but that also means that it's not really beneficial to do this. You auto-attack, then you auto-attack, you auto-attack, and then you auto-attack this one. No, it's better to keep on auto-attacking 1 champion at least to the max stacks, right? That's a lot more efficient in terms of auto-attack damage. Now, obviously in laning phase, typically we'll only be playing 1v1, so that shouldn't be a problem. All right, time to look at our W. We know what our Q does. Right now we can move it into a certain direction. It does damage to all the people it moves towards. Now let's look at our W. Orianna commands her ball to release an electric pulse, dealing magic damage to surrounding enemies. The pulse leaves behind an energy field for 3 seconds. Basically, it's something that slows enemies and it grants us and our allies movement speed. So basically, if you want to, like, let me remove these dummies real quick and let me put some dummies closer to each other. If I put my Q here, I deal damage to all of them. But my W here, if I press W, I will damage all of them. You might not see it properly here, but look at this HP bar. This one also takes damage. So now I do damage and now I do W and all of them take damage, which is kind of important. So this is a certain range in which, around our ball, in which enemies take damage. And also they get slowed, which is really good for trying to chase them down or walking away. Because let's say you're walking away from enemies. So I'm walking away, these guys are chasing me. I can just QW and now they are slowed and I can move away easier, right? Now what I could also do with this ball is it gives me movement speed. So whenever my ball is onto me and I W, I gain movement speed. So what you could do, for example, is you QW enemies, now they're slowed, you walk away, you walk out of your range, and now the ball is onto you and you can W. So you just slowed them and now you have movement speed. So that is why you're so good at chasing people down or at running away from people. Now this W also works for allies. So if I put an ally here and I put my ball onto him and I W, you'll see he also gains the movement speed effect. Right? So it only also works for allies. Now it feels a bit clunky, doesn't it? Like, it's good to like QW on enemies, but it feels a bit clunky that you also have to Q all the way to your ally to then give them movement speed. Doesn't feel right. That's also because it isn't. You have your E ability for that. Let's start with the active of our E ability, not with the passive. So our active says Orianna commands her ball to attach to an allied champion, granting them a shield, and enemies the ball passes through take magic damage. So a lot with our E that we can do, a lot to talk about. So let's start with the active here. We can command our ball. Now what does that mean? I can right now, if I E onto myself, the ball will go to me and it will give me a shield. Right? I can also do it on allies, which is very important. I can do it on allies and now it's onto them and it gives them a shield. And obviously that is where the W comes in. I can just, if the ball is not close to me, instead of having to QW for movement speed, what I can do is I can just E the ball onto me and now W, right? Or I can E an ally really quickly and then W him, right? So that is why the E ability is so important. Now another part about this E ability that's so important is the fact that the ball adds resistances to the ally champion it is attached to. So if the ball is onto you, right now, let's actually put this to the test. Right now, look at my resistances, 91 and 56. If I put the ball onto me, it becomes 121 and 86. It's going to be the same for my dummy here. If I put my E onto him, the magic resist increases. So it's a very strong ability in the sense that you increase people their resistances and they gain a shield. Now, they gain the resistances for as long as the ball is onto them, but the shield does decay after 2.5 seconds. It's the same for you. You gain a shield for 2.5 seconds, but the resistances is something you keep until you move the ball away from you, right? Yeah, another important part about this E is, and you can definitely not forget this, is the fact that enemies that the ball passes through take magic damage. So we just talked about, if we have our Q, for example, right? We have our Q, and we do this, all enemies it passes through takes damage. Well, when you do your E, you retract your ball towards you to gain a shield, but while it's retracting, it doesn't teleport, it like moves towards you. It also can pass through enemies, and then it will also do damage just like your Q, right? So right now the ball is behind them. I'm not queuing towards me, I'm just Eing towards me, and it will damage all the champions that it passes through. So this ability gives you resistances, it gives allies resistances, it gives you a shield, it gives allies a shield, it can and it does damage to the people it passes through enemies, right? Something that's quite important because as Orianna, you can also pick up your ball just manually. Like if the ball is here and you walk over your ball, you just immediately pick it up. Keep in mind, this is a good way to get the ball onto you without having to spend mana, because if you want to get the ball onto you with your E, it will cost you mana. So if you're low on mana and you want to get the ball onto you, you can just walk onto it, and this way you can get the ball onto you. Keep in mind, you don't get the shield this way. You do get the resistances, but you will not get the shield. So if I just walk over it, I don't get the shield. But if I E it onto me, I do get the shield. That's also why it costs mana. Now, let's talk about our ultimates, our last ability, and our strongest ability. Now, if you see these enemies here, what I can do with them is I can, for example, do the basic combo of QW, right? Now, my ultimate is an also big AoE ability. It says Orianna commands her ball to unleash a shockwave, dealing massive damage in the late game to nearby enemies and knocking them in the direction of the ball. So it deals damage, but it also knocks them in a certain direction. So you're going to see that right now. If I press my ult, this is what happens. All the enemies take massive damage in this range here. Look, and they all get drawn into a direction. Now, why is this important? The direction part, it's very underrated, you know. Let's say I have like allies here. So we're gonna create a situation. So we have allies here. We are ally as well, obviously. And then we have some enemies here. So we have a Kaisa and maybe an Ornn. Like, I'm not gonna make it too complicated. So this is a Kaisa and this is an Ornn. Now, if I put my ball here, behind the Kai'Sa, what's going to happen is the enemies will always, basically you can see it like this, when you ult, they will always jump over the ball. So they will jump over the ball like this, and this champion will jump towards here. So this is the Kai'Sa, and this is the Ornn. Yes, right now if I ult, I hit Kai'Sa, which is great. But look what's going to happen with Kai'Sa here. This is Kai'Sa. He is right now on the back end of the fight, and Ornn is in the front, which is really shit. Because right now, again, if this is an Ornn, for example, and this is a Kai'Sa, and I ult, the Kai'Sa goes in the back, and the Ornn goes into the front. Now, if this Ornn is a set, for example, now he's in range to maybe ult my Cho'Gath into my entire team, for example, just saying something. So this is quite important to know that the direction of your ultimate is also very important. So you don't always have to use it to like get a massive hit on people. It's obviously really great if you can. But sometimes, and people underestimate this a lot, it's very good to change the positioning of enemies. If this is a Kai'Sa right now, I would love to like ult, even though I only get like 2 people instead of 5, to get Kai'Sa here if she's like fed. Now she's on the front of the fight and my team can maybe pick her off really, really quickly. So that is really, really important to know. Now, another thing I want to talk about just before we end this here is you can ult. When I put my ball onto an ally, I can also ult around them, right? So this is great for, let's say, like great engage angles, like when you have a Zac or a Jarvan or something, or a Rammus. You just put the ball onto them, and the second they jump into an entire team, you just press ult. And you have like this great wombo combo. And that is what makes Orianna so versatile. The fact that she can do abilities around her and around her ball, but also on enemies, right? Alright, so I also wanted to mention that you can also ult yourself, obviously. So you can put your ball on an ally and then ult them, but you can also ult yourself. So if you put the ball on yourself here and you ult, it will also work. Now this could be beneficial, for example, if you want to do something like this, like you want to like E, Q, ult, that might take some time. So instead what you could do, for example, is you like instead of like EQing ult, you ult flash. It's a bit quicker. So if you have like a very brief window to do something, you just ult flash, right? And be aware that you don't have to like flash ult. You can already diminish the amount of like time that you're not doing anything. Instead of like flash ult, what you can do is you ult flash. So you ult and then flash. Right. This can also catch enemies off guard. For example, let's say you have like an enemy here. Like you can't just randomly, like if you flash ult, they have time to react. Because look at your ultimate, it takes a while, right? You see, like before the damage gets up, before they get knocked, look, it takes a while. So that is not ideal. They always have time to react. But instead, if you, for example, like let's say ult and then you flash, this way they have a lot less reaction time. So this is good if you have like very little time, if you have like a very brief window to pick someone off. So that is basically the last thing I wanted to mention about Orianna's abilities. There might be some extra tips. If I find some extra tips, I'm gonna put them into the comment, into the like tips and tricks with common mistakes type of section. Alright, so when it comes to runes with Orianna, I feel like she's quite straightforward, just like anything else with her, because she's just such a consistent pick with like a lot of good balance in between like utility, damage. Like she's very consistent, therefore everything feels like so straightforward. In terms of runes, there are not that many options. Let's start with the main one. That's going to be this one. There we go. I use this rune page in like 90% of my games, specifically like below diamond when I'm doing a challenge, when I'm playing with friends, when I'm coaching people. I always tell people below diamond to go this rune page because it's just this amazing. Orianna is oftentimes a lane bully. Whether you want it or not, you're gonna end up being a lane bully because of how your champion and your kit works early on. The problem is, especially before you have your tier stacked, before you have your lost chapter, you might run out of mana, so we're gonna have to play smart around all of that. But when you go Airy Scorch, you just give yourself that much more kill pressure, which just feels absolutely amazing. Now, in terms of sorcery tree, I would never change this. I would always go with sorcery tree. Yes, there are a couple of different options. I'm going to talk about them, but not really in depth. However, in the inspiration tree, there are a couple of changes. So I go cookies. Like I said, you don't really have that much mana in the early laning phase. Pre-lost chapter, pre-tier. So I like to go cookies. It just feels that much better to play the lane. Now, on top of that, Cosmic Insight is a great rune because Orianna is a very immobile champion. Therefore, having up your flash is like really crucial, and Cosmic Insight is going to make sure that you do have your flash up more often. In terms of charge, you can basically experiment with this. Personally, I like attack speed. It gives me a little bit more pressure in the lane. both in terms of like wave clear, but also in terms of like poking my opponents with my passive, which feels great. In terms of these shards, you can obviously go magic resist or armor depending on the matchup. I just put health here because yeah, that's just universal, you know. Now there are a couple of changes here. Like for example, let's say I would be playing versus a Zed. Right? Versus a Zed, it's very likely, especially paired up with something like a Karthus in the jungle, it would be very likely that I'm going to go as Zhonya's. In that situation, if I'm planning on buying Zhonya's, might as well give myself 750 free gold and pick perfect timing here in my runes. Right. Now, let's say that I don't have to buy Zhonya's, but why would I still not want to go cookies in some situations? Well, some games require me to have a lot of early game agency. Therefore, I could select something like this here. Cosmic Insight with Futures Market, because Futures Market is going to give me my item power spikes a little bit quicker, which might sometimes be necessary. It depends on the game, but for example, if you see that the enemy team has a lot of early game assassins, stuff like that, and your team as well, you see like the game is very snowbally, like a lot of snowbally champions, then you might want to pick up the pace a little bit in that game, and Futures Market could be one of the tools to help you out with that. Now, another situation would be when I could go something like this, when I go cookies with Time Warp Tonic. Typically, I would combine this. I would only go this when I'm planning on buying Corruption Potion. I'm going to talk about it in builds as well, but this goes really well with Corruption Potion. And the reason why I would go like Biscuits and Time Warp Tonic plus Corruption Potion is I would go this setup when I'm playing versus champions that it's basically unavoidable for me to fight with them. Like when you're playing versus a Sylas, like have fun trying to avoid Sylas jumping onto you. Like sooner or later, and it's probably going to be sooner, he is going to jump around you or he's going to get close to you. Like it's going to be very hard to avoid fighting these type of champs like Yasuo, Yone, Fizz, Sylas, stuff like that. So in those type of matchups where I feel like I'm going to fist fight early on, whether I like it or not, I like to go Corruption Potion with Time Warp Tonic and Biscuits. This gives me an insane amount of sustain, which feels amazing. Now, in those same matchups where you're planning on fighting a lot, and like Sylas or something like that, it could be quite scary to play those matchups. So an alternative for that is you could also go with the Resolve Tree. And then you could go something like Bone Plating with, let's say, Field Bash. This is a very popular one. You could also go Bone Plating with like Overgrowth or even in Flinching, to be honest, if you want to. You could go Overgrowth and Overgrowth and Conditioning as well. You could even go Second Wind depending on the matchup with a certain variety here like that or like this or even like this. There are so many options here. Just experiment with this. I would say that the difference is not that big. The main difference that you need to take into account in these runes is just the difference between Second Wind and Bone Plating. You take Bone Plating against Burst, you take Second Wind against Poke. Other than that, there's not really that much to say about these runes here. But typically I would play something like this here. This would be my main setup. Now there are a couple of other setups, and for example, Phase Rush is going to be one of those setups. Now Phase Rush is great. Why? Well, Orianna she's decent at chasing. She's good at chasing people and running away, but she's still very immobile. So yes, you have some ability with your W, but you lack a very big gap closer, like LeBlanc or W or something like that. Like people can easily get onto you. Like if you're playing versus something like Sejuani Sylas, it's very hard once you get ganked to escape from that. Phase Rush can help you to get away in those type of situations. Phase Rush is really good if you need that extra more safety and if you're planning on scaling anyway, because Phase Rush is ultimately going to be better in team fights than Airy Scorch. So Phase Rush is basically the more scaling option. For example, when would I like to take this? Let's say I'm playing versus a, I don't know, it doesn't really matter what matchup, but let's say I see that the enemy team has a Shaco jungle. Well, typically, even if it was like an easy matchup, and I would go like, let's say I'm playing versus Corki and I would go like Airy Scorch, it's a very easy matchup. If I see that the enemy team has a Shaco, for example, and like an aggressive support as well, like Pyke early on, then I would probably not go with Airy Scorch, even though it's good in the 1v1. I would be like, okay, the enemy team is probably going to want to do something early on, like Pyke roams, Shaco level 2 ganks, level 3 ganks, level 4 ganks, stuff like that. So instead, I'm going to play safe since I'm an immobile champion. I'm not going to overextend, and I'm going to play the scaling game because the enemy team doesn't allow me to play aggressive. So therefore, Phase Rush is better for scaling. Now, when you go Phase Rush, typically you don't want to go Scorch. Yes, you can combine these. You still have the scaling for team fights and you have a little bit more damage in lane. However, typically when I go Phase Rush, I go full scaling and then I will go Gathering Storm over Scorch here. Just for the extra bit of scaling towards the team fights. Now, there are different setups. You could even go like when you go Airy Scorch, you could even go like the inspiration, the domination tree here. You could also go, for example, First Strike is a thing. You could go Unsealed Spellbook. I've even seen people do Conqueror. I wouldn't suggest any of these setups because one, I either think they're suboptimal, or two, they are extremely niche. The only one that I would think of, like, for example, Area Scourge with the Domination Tree could work out. It's quite greedy, but it could work out. And another one as well is going to be Unsealed Spellbook. Lately, I've been experimenting a little bit with Unsealed Spellbook. I haven't been able to test it enough to an extent where I can 100% confidently tell you guys that it's an amazing rune, that you need to prioritize it. So far, Area Scourge feels by far the best, but I am experimenting with Unsealed Spellbook, and I do see the potential that it has. Now, in terms of runes, that's basically everything I wanted to mention about that. Yes, I could go a little bit more in depth, but I also don't want to confuse you people. The main thing is that you go like either Phase Res or Area Scourge, and typically you want to go Area Scourge. That's going to be like the main thing. Also, what I do want to mention here is that, let's go like this. The one thing I do want to mention is that I see people sometimes take magical footwear. I kind of don't like this. The reason why I don't really like this is you're already an immobile champion. And typically, and it also depends on your elo, but against like high elos, you're typically going to be playing against other control mages. Or like skill shot oriented matches like Syndra and stuff like that. In those skill shot oriented matchups, or like Victor for example, in those matchups, it's really easy to dodge those skill shots, or like it's pretty easy to dodge people their skill shots if you have boots early on. But magical footwear kind of doesn't allow you to do that, right? So when you need, like, especially in skill shot oriented matchups, definitely don't go magical footwear. I feel this is like a very greedy option that doesn't really work well with Orianna because you're just that immobile. So I wouldn't really ever consider going magical footwear, even though I've seen people do it. I've seen pro players do it. Personally, I don't really like it. That's everything for runes. There should be more than enough to climb. There should be more than enough, basically, because this is the best rune setup in my opinion. I'm going to change it to this, to be honest, when I say that. This is going to be the best rune setup in my opinion. Yes, you have a couple of different variations, but this is the main one, with Phase Rush being a close second. Anything else like First Strike is something that I do not really recommend. Alright, let's talk about the itemization here for Orianna. Just like anything else, her build paths are going to be quite straightforward. Let's start with the starting items. So when I'm playing, like in basically the majority of my matches, like 9 out of 10 games, I will start with Doran's Ring and 2 potions, just because it gives me the most versatility. Like, if I want to play aggressive, I can. If I want to play a little bit more safe, I can as well. It's like really good all round. Now, if I'm in a very free matchup and I'm planning on buying something like an Archangel staff, like if I'm planning on buying, like upgrading a tier into a full item later on in the game, I'm probably going to start tier. This doesn't happen too often, but like typically against a Corki or something, I would consider going tier. Obviously, when you go tier, this is like a very greedy start. And going teleport with this goes really well, because this way you can easily, like, you can still get your Lost Scepter really quickly with your teleport. But if you start tier and you don't have teleport, you can be stuck in lane for a while, and that would be really bad, because with tier you're really, really weak. Now, a third, but definitely not the worst option here, is going to be Corruption Potion. Corruption Potion is really great in matchups where people can easily get onto you, like level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, for example, a Sylas, a Fizz, a Yasuo, an Irelia, stuff like that. Going Time Warp Tonic with cookies and your runes together with Corruption Potion gives you so much sustain. It's really crazy. As for our boots, we have 3 options again. Typically, in like 9 out of 10 games, I would go with Sorcery Shoes. They're just really, really OP. However, there is a use case for Ionian boots. Well, first and foremost, I'm going to buy Ionian boots if I don't have the gold to buy Sorcery Shoes. So let's say I come out of base, I'm playing in a very skill shot oriented matchup where I need to have more mobility to dodge skill shots, but I don't have the gold yet to buy Sorcery Shoes, then I'm typically going to go with Ionians just because of the lack of gold. Now, there's another proactive reason why I would go this rather than just like not having enough gold. I would consider going Ionian boots if I already have a lead. Ability haste is really broken early on, because if you have like 20% ability, like let's say 20% ability haste from 8 seconds is a lot more significant than 20% ability haste from 2 seconds. Right. Therefore, buying ability haste early on is really good, especially if you can get it early. Like the earlier you get it, the more you can snowball with it. So typically I use this as a snowballing mechanism if I'm in a game where it's very fast paced and I need to do a lot early, or if I already have a lead, like if I get an early kill in a river skirmish or something like that. Now you can definitely also go Mercury Threads. Mercury Threads is something I would consider when the enemy team has a lot of AP or a lot of CC or a combination of both. Typically, I would start consider going this when the enemy team has like an AP duo and the mid and jungle. For example, let's say they have a Syndra mid lane and a Lilia jungle. Now, Mercury Threads is especially good against champions who have like a very high base damage when they get like level 6, for example. Like Syndra is one of those champions who can just basically burn you or like burst you with a QE ultimate combo with W. Against those champions, getting that extra bit of magic resist will give you so much more survivability. It also gives you, obviously, mobility to dodge skill shots, and as well, it gives you CC, for example, for the Syndra stun, and that means you're less vulnerable to getting all-in, which is also great. Now, typically, I make it sound really good, but typically I only go this here, this for snowballing, and only this. I go this in very specific matchups. One of those matchups would be Syndra. Now, let's go to the early, like, situational buys that you could do, because we're gonna look at the, like, standard full build paths in just a bit, but typically you can diverge from that. And you could go something like if you're going versus a Zed, for example, or a Kiana. Like, you know you're going to need a Zhonya's later on. You know you need the armor and lane to sustain. You could go with an early Seeker's Arm Guard. Now, if you're playing versus Syndra, for example, or like just if the enemy team has a lot of AP, then you could go, instead of like Seeker's Arm Guard, you go the Magic Resist variant and you go Verdant Barrier so that you can later on in the game upgrade that into a Banshee's Veil. Another situational buy could be Dark Seal. Typically, I like Dark Seal on Orianna because, yes, a lot of people say, but you're so immobile, so you can't really stack it. It's so dangerous. But on the other hand, the goal of a Control Mage is to stay alive as long as possible, and your positioning should make up for all the other like deaths that you have most of the time. Right? Therefore, I do believe Dark Seal is a great buy if you're snowballing. I wouldn't necessarily buy it early over my other items, but if I'm snowballing, if I pick up an early kill, going something like Boots with Dark Seal out of base is a great option to do so. Now, obviously, another great option is Tear of the Goddess. So, first of all, like Boots is, let me quickly repeat that, Boots is really good if you are in a skill shot oriented matchup like Syndra where you need to dodge skill shots. Now, for Tear obviously you want to pick this up as early as possible if you're planning on buying an Archangel Staff. So typically what I would like to do, if I don't start it, if I just go Deering, then on my first base I would go something like Tear with Boots, and then on my next base I would start building into Lost Chapter. Now, some matchups you don't want to go Lost Chapter first item, and this is gonna sound pretty weird, but here with Fiendish Codex, this is actually a little bit cheaper than Lost Chapter. And it can actually be really, really great in the terms that it gives you both ability haste and ability power, which is a great combination if you're in a rough lane and you need a little bit more like basically help. The ability haste gives you more shielding, it gives you more wave clear, stuff like that, more poke. It's just an overall a really high value item, very gold efficient, and I typically go it when I'm struggling a little bit in lane. Also, on top of that, it does build into Liandry. So if you're planning on building Liandry, which is something we're going to look at later on, this is also a very good early on item. And then last but not least, you can also buy Oblivion Orb. I'm not really a fan of buying Oblivion Orb. I still think that anti-heal is really bad on mages. I don't like it at all. But sometimes versus a Sylas, or when they have like a very high healing team, like let's say they have a Yumi support with a Sylas in the mid lane, for example, that's a lot of healing. In that case, I would consider picking up an Oblivion Orb early on. All right, let's move on to our mythic items. So for the different mythic items, you have Luden's Tempest, we have Liandry's, and we have Crown. Luden's Tempest is, in my opinion, the strongest one, and it's going to be your standard one. It gives you peel in terms of mobility, it gives you raw damage, and the best scaling with flat pen. However, Liandry's is also a great item. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit when you would want to buy that. And then obviously we can also go Crown. I wasn't a big fan of Crown, but they did nerf it a while ago, and that made it actually quite viable. So Crown is definitely an option again. Now, I could theoretically put a fourth item here, which would be Everfrost. I'm not really a fan of Everfrost Orianna, but I do see some use cases for it. when you need when you have like a lot of damage on your team and you need as much utility as possible. When you have something like a, let's say, a Luke support or something that doesn't really do a lot for your team and you have like a lot of damage, then going utility Orianna with something like Everfrost could actually be a thing. Now, so like I said, Ludens is going to be the standard one. It gives you utility in terms of movement speed. It gives you damage. Snowballing with the magic pen is just overall the best mythic. However, if you're playing versus a lot of tanks with like high health, like a lot of max health, then going Liandry's for the max health burn is going to be great. On the other hand, if a lot of people in your team have a lot of AP, then you might want to go with Liandry's because enemies are likely going to buy magic resist, and against people who buy magic resist, burst is not that efficient, but consistent damage is really great, and then obviously Liandry's is your pick to go. Versus assassins, we can also go crown, and not only versus assassins, but in general dive type of champion. People who like to dive you, especially stuff like Akali or Zed, those type of champions, it's really good against. A lot of people, when I coach them, ask me if Rod of Ages is a thing. Definitely not. I believe Rod of Ages is really bad on Orianna, and a good alternative is Crown. So in this situation where you would want to go Rod of Ages, try out Crown, give it a try, and I think you're gonna like it. Now, obviously, we also have some situational items, so I did put it in here. This is very situational. This is obviously a peel-oriented playstyle if you have like a lot of damage in your team. Now, let's move on to the standard full build. So the standard full build is going to look something like this. The main thing you need to take into account here is we just buy the Ludens and we have an Archangel Staff. That's going to be the main thing in this full build. We're going to build an Archangel Staff because the shielding gives you a lot of peel. That allows us to stall out our Zhonya's a little bit later and just buy Deathcap Void and then Zhonya's. This is ultimately the best snowballing, scaling, burst build that also makes you relevant in the early game as well. So this is the build that I enjoy the most. However, this is a build that I've been trying lately, and it's like a very good second. This also feels really good. Now the difference is here, you replace your Archangels with a Shadow Flame. So I like this, I like to go this build when I can get away with it, when I don't need the peel against Archangels, when I don't need the extra mana as well from Archangels. So if the enemies are very squishy typically and easy accessible for me, then I will look to go this build. This is really good, extremely snowballing, very good in fast-paced games and against squishies. All right, so let's move on to some situational legendary items here. Because this is a standard build, and then later we're going to talk about Liandry's. But to the standard build, we have a couple of situational items. So obviously, I include the Zhonya's, but you don't always need Zhonya's. You could also go with Banshee's Veil if you need more magic resist early on. Now, keep in mind, a lot of people would buy something like Banshee's Veil against like a Diana ult or Fiddlesticks ult, but keep in mind, the Banshee's Veil is going to be less useful than Zhonya's, because with Zhonya's you can just dodge those entire abilities. So against big AoE, even though they're like AP damage ultimates, if they're big AoE, I would probably go with Zhonya's over Banshee's Veil in like 90% of the games. Then obviously we can upgrade our Oblivion Orb into a Morella Nomicum if we need it against anti-heal, but I don't like this, so please ask your support to build magic resist anti-heal, because I don't like this at all. Demonic's Embrace is an option when the enemy team has like a lot of tanky champions, and you could ultimately go Demonic's Embrace. In general, this is quite a good item, but it's also quite situational. You wouldn't typically put this in your build because this is like an item that you build if there's no need for anything else. But typically you need that Zhonya's, you need that Void stuff, so then you're just gonna want to skip this. But if there's a lot of tanks, then you can definitely go this. Then we have Cosmic Drive. This is one of my like little secret personal favorite items that I go, you know. Not a lot of people go this, but I really enjoy this. Cosmic Drive is like a perfect item in games, like also in like not necessarily against champions who are like really tanky, but like champions who are just like beefy, like for example like Ryze, Casio, like people who like to go Rod of Ages. People who don't necessarily buy magic resist, but they are quite tanky in those type of games or matchups. It's really good to have a little bit more ability haste and mobility as well to position yourself in those team fights. Like get away from that Cassiopeia, get away from that Ryze, get in more poke and stuff like that, consistent damage. Cosmic Drive is really, really good for that. And you might already guess it, but Liandry's together with Cosmic Drive could be a great option like those type of scenarios. Now I had to put Magi's in here because Magi's is just really good for snowballing. It's in general a really good item, especially on Orianna, because like I said, you can, like Orianna, you're a control mage, you want to stay alive as long as possible. So playing with Magi's, even if you can't consistently stack it, it will teach you the responsibility of trying not to die, which is already more than enough. But in general, it's a really good item if you can use it correctly. And then last but not least, not a lot of people think of this, but Horizon Focus is 100% 100% a viable item on Orianna. It's really good. You proc it with your slows and stuff. Basically, all your abilities are non-targeted abilities. So this item is just amazing. It's really amazing. It's underrated. Still, it's really good, but I would not divert from this build unless, like, again, this is like an item for when they're quite squishy. This could be an alternative for Shadow Flame, for example. So this is more of an item that I would put somewhere in this build rather than in this build. All right, so let's move on. So this is going to be the complete standard build path, just to give you guys an idea of how a build path during a game, what it would look like. So typically I would start with Dorn's Ring and 2 potions. Then on my first back, I would buy a tier and boots if possible. And maybe if I can already buy 1 component of my Lost Chapter. Then on my second base, I would look to continue building on my Lost Chapter or already pick it up. Then once I have Lost Chapter, I would look to build into Luden's Tempest. And once I have my mythic item, my Luden's Tempest, I would look to build Sorcery Shoes afterwards, because you do need the mobility. Then for my second item, if necessary, if I do need the Archangel Staff because they have like beefy teams, I need like the mana, I need to sustain like with the shield, then I can upgrade my tier into an Archangels. I would always advise you to upgrade your Archangels after your Ludens and don't stall it out longer than that. Like, please build it as soon as you can, like after your mythic item, after your boots. If you stall it out, it's only going to become less and less and less useful. Then obviously we're going to follow that up with a death cap so that we spike soon enough, because typically you don't want to get a death cap as a 4th item, because at that point the game is already typically over. Then obviously after death cap, we're going to go build Void Staff, because at this stage of the game, enemies will probably have some magic resist, and then a Zhonya's to give up some more defensive stats. Now, if necessary, you can always interchange it, like you can always go Void Staff before death cap if they already start building magic resist. Sometimes in games, you're gonna need your Zhonya's earlier. This doesn't feel that great, but sometimes you do need to, if they have like a lot of dive assassin type of champions, for example, like stuff like Zed and Evelyn, those kind of combinations, then you might have to become a little bit more creative with your build, but this should be the standard build. All right, let's move on to, well, I don't have a block here, but I would like to include Eliandry's build, so let me quickly do that. So Eliandry's build would look something, well, it's basically the same as this build here, but we would just do it with Liandry. So you could go something like Archangels here, we're gonna build Sorcery Shoes in here. So it would look something like this. So you just do the normal build with a death cap at this point, stuff like that, then a Void Staff, and we will probably finish it up with a Zhonya's. The only difference that I would make here, so this is going to be the standard build, except we change Luden's for this, for Liandry's. The only reason why why I would change this is sometimes you can go, let's say Cosmic Drive here as a second item, and then, for example, skip your Archangels here. And then you go Liandry's Cosmic Drive. Also, typically when I go Liandry's, because I go this in games where, like, I go it against tanks or I go it against teams when my team has a lot of AP on the team, then I also like to go Void Staff second item here, because obviously Liandry's gives you that consistent damage, and Void Staff, obviously, if you need consistent damage, because your team has a lot of AP, that means the enemy team has a lot of magic resist, and in those scenarios, if they have a lot of magic resist, then Void Staff is great as well. So that is something that you could also do. So something like Liandry's into Void Staff, like into Sorcery Shoes, into Void Staff, into Death Cap, for example, stuff like that. And then you can have fun with these type of builds. But generally speaking, this here is going to be your main build. With any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments down below. As for some of the spells, theoretically, you could go Ghost Flash, Flash Barrier, Flash Exhaust, Flash Ignite, Flash Heal, Flash Cleanse, but ultimately the setup that I use in the majority of my games is going to be Flash plus Teleport. Teleport just allows me to be a lane bully while also being able to side lane and still join those team fights that I really need to join. However, with that being said, there are some other setups that I do enjoy going. The first one is Flash plus Heal. Flash plus Heal is especially a great combination in the higher elos. The higher you climb, the more you're gonna realize that mid lane is a 3v3 role. The jungler, mid and support should basically all work together throughout the entire game. In higher elos, this is actually oftentimes the case. That also means that 2v2s and 3v3s happen quite often, and Heal is a very strong summoner spell for situations like that. Now in the lower elo, this will not really be the case, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Now my second alternative is Flash Cleanse. Cleanse is really good against point and click CC like a Twisted Fate Gold card, Maokai W, etc. But like I said, you can basically go Flash Teleport in every game and you'll be fine. So don't overthink it, but also be sure to have some fun with it. Just like with everything else, Orianna's combos are quite straightforward. The difficulty lies in knowing when to use what. For example, in lane it's important to understand that before your first recall it's actually very easy to run out of mana. Therefore, you can't always QW. Your Q mana cost is a lot less than your W mana cost, so it's a lot better to pressure your opponent consistently with Q and only W from time to time. Another very important tip that will prevent you to run out of mana is weaving in enough auto attacks. Weaving in auto attacks in between abilities is important for all mages, but due to Orianna's passive, it's even more important when playing her. So your basic combo in lane will be pressuring your opponent with Q and doing plenty of auto attacks and then W from time to time based on your current mana. Another useful tip can be to use your E in your trades as a damage tool. For example, you can QW an enemy and positioning your ball in a way where it's slightly behind your opponent, and then when you press E on yourself, the ball will damage your opponent as well. Once you get level 6, your basic combo will be chunking people with your QW, and then when they're low enough you can throw a QW ult combo onto them to finish them off. Also keep in mind that you can also ult a full HP lane opponent if it's needed to get lane prio. So with your ultimate unlocked, the difficulty doesn't lie in doing fancy combos but rather in decision making. For example, do you have an engaged champion like Jarvan or Zac on your team? If yes, then it might be smart to put your ball on one of them with E and simply press ultimate when they engage. Now if you lack engage on your team, you could always try to hide your ball in terrain and then catch people off guard. Orianna's combos are all about decision making instead of mechanically outplaying your opponents. Alright, now that we know everything we need to know, let's talk about how to actually play Orianna throughout the game. I'm going to talk in depth about what the laning phase game plan for Orianna looks like, but first let's take a look at the general game plan, including some general concepts for the laning phase as well. During the laning phase, you want to create your initial lead by harassing your opponent as much as possible. Keep your lane opponent low while managing your resources such as mana and potions as good as possible. Your goal during the laning phase is to lock down your opponent in lane and give yourself prio to take favorable recalls, give yourself ward timers and even roam timers. During the mid game, you want to find a balance between side laning to get solo gold and XP and team fighting. Look to crash waves under the enemy turrets while side laning, and afterwards look to move to hover your team and help them win fights or skirmishes. During the mid game, you also have the important role of helping your team secure objectives like dragons, heralds and barons. It's your job to zone enemies from the objective and keep them in a choke point with your ball positioning. Look to ult high value targets and ideally as many enemies as possible. Now keep in mind, Orianna is also great at consistently poking enemies, so even without your ultimate, you still bring a lot of value to the table when teamfighting. Once late game has arrived, you want to start grouping more as death timers become ridiculously long. That means if one person on your team dies, you might have to defend your base in a 4 vs 5 situation for 50 seconds, which is obviously not ideal. Therefore, grouping in the later stages of the game is typically the best option, especially in the lower elos. During teamfights, you have to be very aware of your positioning. You want to position as safe as possible while also being in range to E someone on your team and combine your ultimate with their engage. And obviously, be sure to position behind your front line at all times. Now, I want to go a bit more in depth on the laning phase game plan, as the outcome of the laning phase directly influences your capability to carry games throughout the mid and late game. Now keep in mind, if anything of this sounds too overcomplicated, don't worry, I'm going to show you guys some in-game examples to clear everything up. Now for most laning phases, I like to set up a slow push right from the beginning. Versus mages like Syndra, slow pushing is great because this way they either have to stop your push or trade with you, but if you position properly, they can't do both at the same time, so they are already feeling quite overwhelmed. On top of that, it allows you to hit your level power spikes quicker, which makes trading even easier, and if you manage to do a 3-wave crash for example, the enemy laner might actually have a very hard time CSing under the turret that early into the game. Versus melee matchups like Zed, I also like slow pushing early on because it allows me to punish them level 1, 2, 3. I also get my level power spikes earlier, which again makes it easier to trade, and I can do a 3-wave crash into a freeze on my side of the lane to make them feel absolutely miserable. However, there is a side note to this. Typically, I wouldn't look to slow push into champions that spike really hard at level 2, like an Irelia or even a Yasuo. That's because those champions will hit level 2 before I can crash the wave, and then they're strong enough to run me down and even freeze the wave. I feel like the first 3 waves are by far the most important to get it right, because for the majority of the lane you will just copy those wave mechanics. You will typically look to slow push and do it as slow as possible. This way, since you're slow pushing, you will eventually get prio because you're looking to crash the wave under the enemy turret, and because you do it as slow as possible, you maximize your time to bully your lane opponent. Because typically, once you crash the wave, you don't really want to bully them under the dirt, because that way you can easily get ganked or run down by your opponent. So typically, if you want to bully your lane opponent, you have to do it while pushing, and that's why we maximize the time that we push by slow pushing and doing it as slowly as possible. Slow pushing has multiple advantages. Well, obviously the first one being that if you're slow pushing, then ultimately you are going to crash the wave under the enemy turret. Meaning that the enemy is stuck under the turret, farming minions, when you can actually go for a recall or you can go for a roam, whatever you like. Now, another advantage of this, and you're going to see this in a bit, is when you're pushing, you make it very favorable for you to trade with your opponent. When you're pushing, your wave is bigger as well. Meaning that when the enemy trades with you, they will take more minion aggro than you will from his minion wave, because your minion wave will be bigger. So trading will go better. Also, especially in the early levels, level 1, 2, 3, when you're pushing, you get more XP than your opponent, because you kill his minions quicker than he does yours. So you gain XP faster, meaning you will get level 2, level 3 faster, again, making trading a lot easier. Another part of this is that when you're pushing towards someone, they have to make the choice. Do they push back? Do they try to match your pushing? Or do they attack you? They can't do both of them at the same time if you position correctly. For example, if you're always standing in your minion wave, then you give your opponent, if they have like AoE abilities like Victor E, if you always stand in your minion wave, you give them the opportunity to hit you and to wave at the same time. This way they can push towards you and they can get you low at the same time, which is really bad because they get to prio in two ways, right? Because they get you low and they get wave prio. However, if you stand next to your wave, they have to make a choice. So when you're pushing to your opponent and you're standing next to your wave, the beauty of that is that they have to make a choice. Do they attack you or do they attack the wave? All right, so let's play this out. So here, we're just obviously in a real game. When you're playing with another champion, you're gonna want to match their auto attacks on the wave, and you always want to do two, like something like that, like 2 auto attacks more than your opponent, just so that you can get that extra push, because you want to be pushing towards your opponent, right? So here, I can't really push right now because there's no lane opponent. So if I just last hit minions and there's no lane opponent who can also last hit minions, I'm basically automatically pushing. Because in a real game, when I'm last hitting minions and my opponent is last hitting minions, well, both of us are basically pushing the same amount, because both of us are just last hitting minions. But right now I'm last hitting minions and there's no opponent, so I'm automatically pushing, right? So here I'm going to do it as slow as possible, but in a real game you want to do the same thing. The only difference is you're also going to have an opponent who's going to want to last hit, or maybe even push, and you just try to match their push plus 2 extra auto attacks. If needed, if they are very aggressive with the wave, you can look to Q the entire wave to get like prio as well. Orianna is really good at getting prio. Now you're going to see the benefit of this in just a bit. Look how big our wave is already getting, right? This makes sure that we're going to hit level 2 already, right? We already hit level 2, we have a lot bigger of a wave. So now our opponent would still be level 1 at this scenario, so we can walk up and be very aggressive with them, because we have a level advantage, so we have a 1 extra ability, plus our wave is bigger, so we have multiple advantages here. So right now, all you want to do in situations like this is you want to harass your opponent as much as possible and just stand next to your wave. Now, the reason why I talk to you guys about, in the guide, I talk to you guys about why I want you to slow push as slow as possible. Or the reason is, the faster you get to here, then you can't really bully your opponent here because you're in a very overextended position. I'm going to talk more about that in just a bit. But right now, you're still in the middle of the lane. You can still be quite aggressive. You want to stay as long as possible on your side of the lane, or at least as close as possible to it, so that you can always keep on bullying your opponent. That's why when we're pushing towards someone, we do it as slowly as possible, so that we maximize the time that we can poke them. Now, why do we want to push in general? Well, that gives us prio. If you push, ultimately you're going to get under the enemy turret, and that means they're stuck and you can move. So this playstyle, if you push, you get prio ultimately, obviously if you're strong enough, then you get prio, and if you do it slow enough, you still have time to punish your opponent as well. So you get best of both worlds. I'm going to let it play out here, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit. So I just shove in this wave here ultimately. The reason I'm typically going to try to shove in the wave, I'm going to do it on the 3rd wave, because the 3rd wave, the crash is really good, because you crash a cannon minion wave, meaning that the enemy will be stuck under the turret for a longer time compared to a non-cannon wave. So you get more time to recall, you get more time to roam, you get more time to ward, stuff like that. Also, you only, like after killing the cannon wave, if you farm correctly, that's when you have enough gold to take a recall, for example, and buy something like a dark seal. If you only kill 2 waves, you should not have enough gold to buy something like an amplifying tome or a dark seal. After 3 waves, you do. That's why I typically like to shove in 3 waves. It gives me the most versatility in terms of my gameplay. Now, like I said, level 1, level 2, it's easy to bully your opponents, but once you get here, once you crash the wave under the enemy turret, it feels a bit scuffed to stay here. Because if you're playing versus a Katarina or a Yone or something like that, well, level 1, level 2, you can easily bully them. Level 3 can also bully them if they're still level 2, but they're gonna hit level 3 here from this wave. So you don't want to stay here against a Katarina, for example, who's really good at running people down in this overextended position when she hits level 3. That's a really bad thing to do. So instead, we just let the wave crash, we walk away, we use our time for a ward, for example, and we come back and we just look to last hit minions. Now, another big part of this game plan is when you crash this wave, there's a very big thing that you need to understand. So let me quickly explain that to you. If you crash a wave in an enemy turret, there's 2 things that can happen with the next couple of waves. It will either push back all the way to your turret again, or both waves will meet into the middle of the lane. Now, if you, let's say you push in 2 minions under the enemy turret, and the enemy can kill those 2 minions before the next wave arrives. Meaning, those 2 minions just die, nothing happens, the next enemy wave just walks, keeps on walking in the middle, and it will reach the middle of the lane. Why? Well, it doesn't get hold up, it can just keep on walking, your wave can just keep on walking, both waves hit the middle of the lane. Right? So if you push in minions, and they die before the enemy wave arrives, then both waves are just gonna meet into the middle. But, if you crash a wave under the enemy turret, and the next wave that's walking to lane here, this minion wave, gets hauled up by it, they start attacking the blue wave, they are not running right now, they just start attacking here, only this wave is running, in that situation, the wave is ultimately going to push back towards your side of the lane. I'm not going to go too in depth on why that is, it's actually quite simple, but it does require some time. Just remember that if you crash minions under the enemy turret and they hold up the next enemy wave here, like this scenario, then it will automatically push back towards your side of the lane. Now that's important because that gives you a freezing opportunity. You're going to see if a wave, I'm going to speed this up here a little bit. If a wave pushes back towards you, look, it slowly but surely is pushing back towards us. If a wave pushes back like this towards us, we have the opportunity to freeze the wave here in front of our turret, which is especially good against melee champions. So right now, look, the wave is all the way on our side of the lane. It's going to keep on pushing and then we can look to freeze it here, for example. If you're playing versus Zed, or if you're playing versus Katarina, that really sucks for the Katarina, right? Because if she wants to break that freeze, or if she just wants to farm last hit, she kind of has to walk up in an overextended area. Meaning that makes her very vulnerable to your attacks. You can run her down, or your jungler can run her down as well. And she won't feel comfortable to like trade with you, or like she won't feel comfortable to like farm because she's always in an overextended position. That's really good for you. You're always putting pressure on her that way. Now, if you wanted to freeze, how do we do that? Well, right now, if we don't kill a couple of minions, this wave will be so big that it will just kill my wave instantaneously, and I won't be able to freeze it because I will have to tank like 20 minions, right? That's not a good idea. Instead, in order to freeze here, you basically need 3 red minions, 3 enemy minions, preferably melees. You could do it with range, but I like to go with a little bit more than 3, so that when sometimes you have like Riot Spaghetti Code, where a minion walks under your turret, and that accidentally breaks the freeze. So if I freeze very close to my turret, I like to keep like around 4 minions here to hold the freeze. That feels really comfortable. Now you're gonna see here, if I don't do anything, if I don't kill these minions, the wave just becomes so big. Look, they kill all my minions. And right now, can I, like, if an opponent was here, can I hold this entire wave while an opponent is damaging me? So I have to tank all of this damage and the damage of the opponent. I can't really do that. Right? So if you want to freeze here against a melee champion, be sure to trim the wave until like 4 minions, for example. Right? That's a very comfortable spot. Now, I did let the wave crash, and I did that on purpose, because I'm going to do this another time. Don't worry, I'm going to speed it up, the process. But I'm going to do it twice from this point. Like from this point, you're going to see what I do twice. First of all, I'm not going to do it that good, right? Just to show you the difference. So right now, a wave is under our turret, and what is happening? It holds up our next wave This blue minion wave can't keep on walking towards the middle of the lane. It gets held up by this wave. Meaning, ultimately, the wave state will move from here, it will move all the way to here again. So it will push back towards the enemy. No matter what we do, we will be pushing. The only thing that we can control is whether we push fast or whether we push slow. If we kill these minions very quickly, we're going to push very fast towards here. If we do it slow, we're going to push very slow towards here. What's the benefit? Well, we're going to want to do it slow. And you're going to see that in just a bit why. So here, I'm going to start QWing this wave here, be a little bit more aggressive with the wave, push it relatively quickly. And now what's going to happen? You're going to see how fast I'm actually moving. Look, I'm already am I moving towards the enemy side of the lane this early on, which kind of sucks because it's very nice for us to be in this position. If an enemy walks up, they are overextended, they are vulnerable to jungle ganks, we can easily run them down and poke them. Because we can poke them because we're under our turret or close to it. Our opponents can't really damage that much. They can't really trade that much with us because we're under our turret. They can easily take third shots or they don't have that much space to actually trade with us. Now, since we fast push this, we are very quickly on this side of the lane, which kind of sucks because now we're in an overextended position, right? So again, doesn't really feel comfortable, so I'm going to speed up this process. We push in a wave, the next wave gets held up, it pushes back towards us, and now we're going to see the second scenario. So look, again, you could freeze it here, you have to kill a couple of minions to freeze it here. I'm not going to do it, I'm just going to let it crash. And this right now is this is going to be a completely different scenario right now. Compared to last time, right now, I'm not going to do a single auto attack. Obviously, in a real game, you want to do last hits, but it's to show you the big difference. Right now, I'm not going to do anything. So I'm going to make sure that the wave pushes as slowly as possible towards the enemy side of the lane. And just look how long we're here in this position. I'm going to speed it up a little bit, but not too much so that you get a feel for it. We're still in this position right now. Our opponent, if he wants to farm, if he wants to take this cannon, or this minion here, he still needs to walk up. He's still very vulnerable to jungle ganks and we can still poke him very easily and maybe run him down ourselves. So again, we're very long in this position. This is sped up ×2, right? Again, we're still not away from this position. We're still in a very comfortable position, quite close to our turrets, right? So this, while we're pushing, we have all this time to poke our opponent. That's why we do it as slowly as possible. The longer the wave is on our side of the lane, the more we can poke our opponent, the more pressure we can put in our opponent. Right now, obviously we're pushing. So here, for example, you want to make sure that this wave right now crashes. Because right now, if we wait very long with pushing in this wave, it might not crash. The next wave might get here in time. And then you might have the issue of your wave being in front of the enemy turret, but not completely crashing. And that gives a freezing opportunity for your opponent, which is obviously not something you want. But I hope right now that you see the difference here in between the first and the second concept. The first time around, when the minions were under turret, we fast pushed the minions and we were very quickly on their side of the lane, which sucks. In the second scenario, we pushed as slowly as possible so that we maximize the time here. It took very long to go from here to here. That maximizes the time that we have to punish our opponent and that our opponent is vulnerable to jungle ganks. Now, once you're here, your opponent is stuck, you can look to roam, you can look to place wards, you can look to recall, you can look to do all that fun stuff. But this is typically what you want to do as Orianna. You want to push because then ultimately you're going to crash the wave, giving you prio. But you want to do it as slow as possible so that you can poke your opponent as much as possible. The trading will come intuitively. If, for example, you're going to see that in game, if you're pushing away from your turret and you want to push, but your opponent is constantly looking to kill your minions so that you can't push, well, automatically, since you want to crash the wave, you're going to want to punish the opponent. You're going to want to trade with him to make him stop, kill your wave. So if you have an intention with the wave, your gameplay will be very intuitive and you will immediately adapt your playstyle to that to basically fulfill your goal with the wave. Alright, so before we take a look at the matchup and skin tier lists, let's talk about some tips and tricks for playing Orianna. 1. Orianna's bow gives her vision, making it the perfect tool to check for vision in brushes or over walls and spot out enemies when you don't have any wards available. You can also use the brushes to hide your ball and pick off enemies when you know that the enemies didn't ward it. 2. You can place Orianna's ball in terrain to make it near impossible to spot for enemies, which allows you to catch people off guard once again. 3. While picking off people is great, it's extremely important that you don't rush your R usage. If necessary, hold on to it for a while just to find the best possible angle. 4. Keep in mind that Orianna's R can be a great tool to drag enemy high value targets from the backline of the fight to the front line, making them a lot more vulnerable. But then again, that also means that if you don't pay attention to this, that you can accidentally drag an enemy set, for example, from the backline to the front line, making you and your team a lot more vulnerable. 5. When freezing your opponent in lane, keep in mind that freezing is really powerful early on in the game, but after hitting level 6 it becomes a lot less viable and a lot less valuable. So I do suggest that once you hit 6, you start to play more for prio to actually impact the map. 6. Since Orianna has very little sustain in her kit, tanking too many enemy skill shots can be lane losing. However, acting like you're a god at dodging is typically also not gonna work out, because it's quite impossible to dodge every skill shot. Instead, look to bait out enemy abilities from time to time so that when their abilities are on cooldown, you can do whatever you want. One of the easiest ways to bait out enemy abilities is by acting like you're gonna walk up to last hit a minion, but then immediately walking back. Alright, so when playing Orianna, it's really important, and when playing any other champion to be honest as well, it's really important that you're always in a position to pressure your opponent, right? Now I did coach a Vladimir player yesterday with a clip that is perfect to explain this, so it's not going to be Orianna gameplay, but don't worry about that because what I'm going to show you is just as applicable to Orianna or even any other champion for that matter. Now the reason why I do explain this in an Orianna guide is because it's going to be even more important to do this on Orianna than on all the other champions. So let's get into it. So what I'm talking about is currently we're playing versus a Victor. And Victor is doing a skill shot, he's just doing an ability at us. And whether he hits it or whether he misses it, we are never in a range, we are never in a position to trade back with the Victor. And that's the biggest problem here, we're not pressuring Victor. Ideally, you want to not position behind your wave, because then you have to play very linear, like always walking back and forth. But you also want to be playing sideways next to the wave. Now the reason for that is multiple things. First of all, if you stand behind your wave, you give Victor a opportunity to hit you and the wave at the same time, which happens here. Also, you can't really pressure him, and that's the main point that I'm trying to make here. If Vladimir right now, or if the Victor misses his E on the Vladimir right now, it does not hit. Well, it doesn't really matter, because Vladimir is still not in a position to trade with the Victor. He can't punish the Victor for missing his E because he's not even in range to punish him, right? Because we're playing too safe. What we should do is we should position next to the wave sideways here, so that one, Victor has to make a choice. Does he hit us? Does he hit the wave? Right? If he hits the wave, we can trade with him. We punish him for doing auto attacks and abilities on the wave, so we trade with him. If he hits us, we can choose to trade back with him or shove in the wave and get prio that way. And if he misses the ability, then we're also going to be in range to trade back with him and punish him for missing it. Right now, we're not doing that. Now, you could make the argument, I know a lot of people are going to be in the comments like, but he doesn't have any vision of Vladimir here, so like it's normal that he plays safe. No, that was the case for the entire laning phase. I'm not going to go through the entire game, but throughout the entire laning phase, we are playing front to back, always standing behind the minion wave, and I see this a lot in my coachings. People don't like to stand next to the minion wave, but this way you put so much more pressure on your opponent, so please do this. Pre-tier or pre-loss chapter is quite easy to run out of mana when playing Orianna, so manage your mana bar well. The best way to do this is by pressuring your opponent as much as possible with Q and auto attacks, and only use W from time to time based on your current mana. Don't forget that you can R yourself and then flash into enemies. This combo isn't that useful, but sometimes it can be of amazing value if you only have a very brief window to make a play, because the combo is just extremely quick. Now, I already mentioned that you shouldn't rush your ultimate during teamfights or skirmishes, and that you have to wait if necessary until you have a good angle. Now, I want to add to that doesn't mean that you can't act like you're gonna use your ult. When doing Dragon, for example, you can position your ball to zone off enemies and just act like you're gonna ult them, even though you don't have a good angle. The pressure oftentimes drives enemies completely crazy. Alright, so let me quickly explain what I mean with pressuring enemies, even though you're not in a position to ult actually. So what we're going to do here is, let's say you have a dragon fight right now that you're fighting with your team, your teammates are taking it. You could place your ball in this position. Now, what is that going to do? Now, even though you don't have ultimate, you can still act like you do have your ultimate. Typically, especially in lower elos, people are not going to know the exact cooldown of your ultimate. So if it's on a 10, 20, 30 second cooldown, they will probably not even know whether you have it or not. So you can basically have your poker face and make sure that you pressure them into thinking that you have your ultimate. And this way you might actually just stall them from going in here and therefore you get a free dragon. So keep that in mind. You don't need to actually have your ultimate up in order to pressure people. If you find yourself struggling in skill shot oriented matchups, consider picking up early boots to have that extra mobility to dodge those skill shots a bit easier. You can put your ball on allies with your E when they're in stealth as well, and the ball will be invisible. For example, when you have a Twitch or Evelyn that's invisible, you can put your ball onto them and enemies will not be able to see that they can potentially be Orianna ulted, which is obviously amazing. Since Orianna doesn't have that much mobility and sustain, it's crucial that you don't tank too many skill shots. One of the ways to react to skill shots that are difficult to predict is just having high APM. APM stands for actions per minute and basically means that the more you click, the easier it is to react to things. Due to your lack of mobility, you're very vulnerable to jungle ganks as well. Therefore, it's crucial that you either do jungle tracking or warding, and preferably both. However, keep in mind that warding, especially in the lower elo, doesn't have to be that complicated. As long as you can put a ward down, you have a side of the map to hover and that makes you very safe. Obviously, keep in mind that if you're playing versus long-range junglers like Zac and Jarvan, or even Rammus and Hecarim, for example, who can jump over walls or just are very quickly in general, you might have to put your wards a bit deeper into the enemy jungle to spot them out earlier. Alright, so let me quickly debunk a myth. People think that warding is very complicated, and I feel like content creators do a pretty good job of acting like it is, but it definitely is not. Warding is quite simple, especially in lower elos, because warding really becomes a little bit more difficult if you try to combine it with jungle tracking. Now the thing is, or the neat thing is in lower elos, is that jungle tracking is not really that good because you can only do it for the first or second clear. After the first or second clear, junglers don't really know what to do. They lack a clear game plan, they lack intentions, so if they don't know what to do, how are we going to predict what they're going to do if they don't even know? So therefore, we don't really need to do jungle tracking, or at least not in the lower elos. What we can do is just we need to ward properly. Now, what is warding properly? Well, warding properly is basically meaning that you just need to put a ward on the map somewhere. If you don't know, let's say we're in the game and we have no idea where the enemy jungler is right now. If you don't know the enemy jungler's position, that's fine. You can just place a ward on whatever side of the lane or the map what you think is good, right? So, for example, if you put a ward here, well, what's the good thing about that? Well, the good thing is that all we need to do right now to be safe in lane is hover this side of the map here. We want to hover our own ward. Now, the reason for that is if a jungler comes from here and we're hovering this side, we're still safe even though we're hovering the side of the jungler, because this ward hill will give us vision of the jungler the second he already shows up here. So if we have decent map awareness, we have enough time to react and we can just back out. Now, in case that we're hovering this ward and the enemy jungler is on this side of the map and tries to gank us from here or from here, well, we also have enough time to react if we have enough awareness, and we also just walk away like this, or we walk away to our turrets because we do have enough time. Now, there is a problem with this ward, that if you're playing versus a Zac or a Jarvan or a Rek'Sai, junglers who can like jump from far away or jump over walls, or maybe even junglers who are fast like Hecarim and Rammus, then putting a ward this close towards you is quite greedy, in the sense that, well, Zac, like if you put a ward here and you think that you're safe from ganks from this side, and you're laning versus Zac, you're playing versus Zac in the enemy jungle, then he can just jump from here to here and he will easily hit you because you were hovering his side of the map. You thought you were safe, but you weren't. So against some junglers like Jarvan, like Rek'Sai, like Zac, like Rammus, like Hecarim, you want to put your wards not here, but you want to put them a little bit deeper so that you can spot them out earlier, right? And then we can still hover this side here, then we can still hover this side of the map here if we put a ward, for example, here that spots them out a little bit earlier, right? Now you can also choose to put a ward here, you can choose to put a ward here. It depends on the jungler, but this is how you typically like to ward. Now there's a small side note to this. I said that when you don't know where the enemy jungler is, you can just place a ward on whatever side that you want to. Obviously, keep in mind that if you don't know where the enemy jungler is, but a dragon is up, I wouldn't randomly just say, oh, I don't know where the enemy jungler is, I'm just randomly going to put a ward top lane. Well, if dragon is up, I would opt to put my ward on the bot side, purely based on the fact that, yes, I don't know where the enemy jungler is, but it might be useful to have some vision on the side where a big neutral objective just spawned. So there are some like rules of the thumb, like if a big objective is up, you can ward this side of the map, or maybe if your jungler is on this side of the map, it would also be more smart to put a ward on this side of the map here, so that you can hover it, so that when a fight breaks out here, you're already hovering this side and you can very quickly move, right? Other than that, warding does not have to be more complicated than this, especially in lower elos. Now, obviously, the higher you climb, the more value you get out of jungle tracking. For the lower elo, especially below diamond, this is completely fine. In terms of matchups, the main factor that determines if laning phase is going to be difficult is typically the enemy jungle setup. Orianna, her biggest weakness is mobility. So even something like a Twisted Fate, which is actually an easy matchup in the isolated 1v1, can become really scary when paired up with something like a Sejuani. Other than that, there's not much to say really, so feel free to pause or come back to the tier list whenever necessary. The reason why I don't really go too in depth on matchup tier list is because it depends so much on elo. I feel like a tier list is like only decent for the higher elos because that's when it truly matters, because that's when both players know how to play the matchup, and that's when a real rough matchup is actually rough. In the lower elos, your opponents will make a lot of mistakes, so it doesn't really make sense to say, hey, this matchup is hard and this matchup isn't playable when you're playing versus a player who's playing like at 30% of how you should play as champion. So basically every hard or unplayable matchup is very playable in the lower elos. That's why I don't really like tier lists, but I did make one and put my time into making one just for the people who do like it. I know there are some people out there who do like it also in the lower elos, and just take it with a grain of salt, right? Don't focus too much on the matchup tier list. Just focus more on your own skills and you should actually get away with almost playing out every single matchup. In terms of skin tier list, there's nothing I can say. Skins are completely subjective, but personally I think that Orianna has multiple great skins, with Winter Wonder Orianna being my absolute favorite. I mean, come on. Her ball is literally a robot Poro. If that doesn't convince you to buy this skin, then I don't know what is. No, but honestly, I think that even Orianna's basic skin looks really cool, so you definitely don't have to spend any money on a new skin to enjoy playing her. With all of that being said, you should be more than ready to start your own Orianna journey or improve on your current one. If you're still here, you're an absolute legend, and I would like to ask if you could leave a like and subscribe on your way out, because this video, frankly, took me a really long time to make. Now, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. And if you're interested in personal coaching, feel free to check out the link in the description down below. And last but not least, thank you for watching this video, and hopefully I'll see you in my next one. Bye.